So tonight we have the privilege of putting on the lenses of theology from the Philippines. Our prayer is that you will be enriched tonight by Rico's wisdom and insights, and that you would go home and seek out more ways to put on the lenses, the glasses of the global church. Most importantly, he's married to Rosemary, and they have 2 grown children, Emir and Faye. In the Philippines, Rico has been a pastor, but he's also currently teaching part-time at several institutions. Rico is the Asia Regional Commissioning Editor for Langham Publishing and the Scholar Care Coordinator for current PhD Langham scholars in Asia. And if that wasn't enough, you can also look up his PhD, which is The Uncertainty of Hearing, a study of the sudden change of mood in the Psalms of Lament. Rico received his PhD in Old Testament at Trinity College, University of Bristol in the UK. And I would just love for you to give a very warm and heartfelt welcome to a beautiful, wonderful scholar from the global church, Rico Villanueva.
Magandang gabi. That's how you say good evening in the Philippines, in Filipino. Maganda literally means beautiful, you know. Actually, the evening is more beautiful in Filipino, even if it is freezing cold, you know. I arrived here from, I think the Philippines is 90 degrees Fahrenheit, you know, and then evening came here. So it's a beautiful evening, you know. Okay, thank you, Carl, for that introduction. And it's first time for me to be having someone to be introduced for, you know, to introduce me, and so I get confused, you know, but I feel really honored. The word privilege, the word honored has been mentioned a lot, and I really feel honored. You know, this is a privilege for me to share with you as from Asia, from Philippines, you know, and to be allowed here to speak to you. This is I'm really grateful to the Lord for that. And I'm also a proud Langham scholar, so I am what I am today, you know, standing before you sharing my scholarship because Uncle John started Langham Partnership, which is a vision of supporting, you know, majority world scholars. I didn't have money to, you know, to study abroad or, you know, even in fact, I started lamenting, you know, I started learning lament when I was seeking for scholarship because I said, why is it, Lord, that it is only those people, you know, who can study and so on? But I learned early on that when you really lament, you know, that God hears you, you know. Lament is different because it really comes from the deepest part of our being, you know, the longing, you know. And so tonight I will talk about that. Thank you, David, for inviting me, Dr. Capes, for inviting me to share about this favorite topic of mine on lament, you know. Some people are asking you, when will you move on, you know? Actually, I was pastoring a church in Manila, and it was actually my pastoral experience which led me to the lament, because I was pastoring a church and I noticed that even though we go through a lot of difficulties, one of my members got his house burned, somebody lost a loved one, and so on. We keep singing the same song. It's the happy songs, you know, like victory song. And most of these songs come from here, like, or Hillsong and so on, you know, which are good and nice and beautiful, but sometimes they don't fit with our situation. So I said, why are we doing that? So I had some heart searching, and I was led to the lament. So even before I did my PhD, I had the opportunity through Langham to do my PhD. I already knew what my research project would be on, lament. That was 20 years ago when I did the research on the lament. And now I'm still working on lament. And it's getting better because now it's not just lament, it's tragic lament. So if you know, for those, when will you move on? It's getting more intense, isn't it? You know, tragic lament. Okay, because I believe we need this because of what's happening in our world today. And let me just share with you about the situation in terms of the lament. Almost 4 decades ago, 40 years ago, The famous American biblical scholar Walter Brueggemann, and I know many of you know him, wrote an article which he entitled "The Costly Loss of Lament." Brueggemann considers the loss of lament as costly because without lament, there will be no genuine covenant interaction. Believers would become subjects who are always, he says, yes men and women, yes women, just yes, yes Lord, according to one song, from whom never is heard a discouraging word. That's what it says. An important contribution of lament, according to Brueggemann, is that it tells us that something is not right in the present arrangement. And so the absence of lament leads to the stifling of questions, of justice, and so on. And we'll have this problem. Since the publication of his article 40 years ago, there have been numerous publications on lament over the past decades. Some believe there's now a flurry of works on lament, and that is an indication that now many have noticed the costly loss of lament, because there's now many writings about lament. But while it is true that there's now a flurry of works on lament, it is doubtful whether many have noticed the costly loss of lament. Brueggemann's observation about the absence of lament in the church more than 40 years ago, actually, he wrote these words even before he wrote The Costly Loss of Lament. He says, it is a curious fact that the church has, by and large, continued to sing songs of orientation in a world increasingly experienced as disoriented. That was more than 40 years ago. When he says disoriented and sing songs of orientation, he's referring to the three seasons of life. So he refers to the work of the French philosopher Paul Ricoeur. There's so the season of orientation, the season of disorientation, and the season of new orientation. And the beautiful thing about the Psalms is that there is a psalm for every season of life. When you are in orientation, you have the hymns, praise. When you are in disorientation, you have laments. Okay? And when you are in a season of new orientation, you have the thanksgiving psalms. No? But why is it that in the church, we only have hymns, and thanksgiving, but not much lament? When in fact, there are more laments in the Psalms, about a third of them, than praise and thanksgiving. Okay. One would think, and I also thought, that with the pandemic, there would finally be an appreciation of the lament, the costly loss of lament. But as Tim Judson writes, despite the clarion calls and a pandemic that might have brought the world to its knees, many Christian communities remain largely resistant to lament. According to the Christian Copyright Licensing International, CCLI, out of the top 100 songs being sung in church, and they do record this, they have a study, out of the 100 songs being sung in the top 100 during the height of the pandemic, there was only one song that could begin to be described as including lament. Mm-hmm. And I saw this first time, even during the time, almost done with the pandemic. I saw this when, in my first in-person gathering, so we were about 2 years in lockdown. And then I was invited to, just before the pandemic, I was invited to speak at a conference in the United Kingdom. There are about more than 300 people, mostly senior missionaries. And that was the time when, so you have the pandemic, okay? And then Russia invaded Ukraine, as if the pandemic is not enough, Now we have another war in our midst, And so I was in that gathering, I was thinking, maybe we should really lament, because I thought, this is a Terrible is even an understatement, isn't it? And these are senior missionaries. They would know. I said they should know. But I was wrong. During the entire 3-day conference, there was not even a single lament song. The very first night sets the tone. The very first song, or one of the first songs that we first sang, is 10,000 Reasons, the famous, 10,000 Reasons, If it says, bless the Lord, okay, bless the Lord, O my soul, sing like never before. Bless the Lord, O my soul. Yeah. Worship, this song, no? Sing like never before. But while I was standing there, looking at the screen and reading these words, actually I found it hard to sing, to join in, How could I bless the Lord when at that very moment, people are being forced to flee their homes? In the cold, cities there were being bombed, people are being killed. How could I sing like never before when an assisted living facility had been bombed, just been bombed, and the most vulnerable, the children, the elderly, were struggling to find a safety on a cold night? The first stanza says, the sun comes up, it's a new day dawning. It's time to sing your song again. The sun. Where was the sun? People in Ukraine could not even see the sun because of the heavy shelling and the clouds rising from the exploding bombs. The song 10,000 Reasons speaks of a new day dawning. What sort of a new day? Even now, almost 3 years, they're still being bombed almost every night. I have a brother there and a friend, a colleague, a Ukrainian friend, who will text me, and even just during this Christmas, one of the posts that was sent, he sent us is this. He says, in Ukraine skies, different lights, he says, pierce their darkness. But it's not the star of Bethlehem that we see, but the deadly glow of incoming missiles. Kamikaze drones and anti-aircraft fire. Our nights echo not with the angelic choirs, but with air raid sirens, explosions, and the cries of the wounded. Sometimes in this group chat, I cannot read anymore, so I don't read because almost every day there's someone who dies, a funeral, until now. Just at this very moment, these are not in the news, but that's the reality. Now, please don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that we should no longer sing 10,000 Reasons. It's a beautiful song. It's also my wife's favorite. Yeah, if she wants to piss me off, she would play that song. But there you go. I told her. We had some discussions about this. It's okay. It's a lovely song. But as I look back, that 3 years ago, I can't help but ask, why is it, that in the midst of one of the darkest, most disoriented periods in our history as humanity, were we singing this song? Why were we not singing songs of disorientation? Where are the laments just when we needed them? Don't we have songs, to help us identify with those who were weeping? I'm not just rejoicing under a praise song. I'm not saying we should no longer sing praise song. Why is it only praise? And at that very moment, I don't understand. Brueggemann spoke of the costly loss of lament. I think the loss of lament is not just merely costly. It is now tragic. It is just tragic loss of lament. It has become tragic when the church continues to sing only praise, because when it continues to sing only praise, it becomes deaf to the cries of those who suffer. It's only praise. When there is no lament and only praise, the status quo is maintained. And when the status quo remains, the wicked flourish, and those who suffer are left on their own. Nathaniel Carlson is right, and I quote, In a world of pervasive trauma, the church's exclusion of lament is nothing short of tragic. It's tragic. What has led to this? No? Why is it that despite the clarion calls and many publications on lament and so on, is there a tragic loss of lament, as I call it? In this lecture, we try to answer that question why first, no? And look at some of the possible reasons. There are many reasons already given, but possible reasons, but I'll just share with you three. And then after that, we will look at what we can do, possibly. There's just too much about this. You know, I just try to cram in as many as I can in a short period of time, because I'm writing a book, by the way, and about this, which I entitle as well as Tragic Lament. So what I'll be sharing with you are some of the things that I've been thinking through, and I would appreciate your comments at the end as well, which will help me, you know, as a feedback. You know. More than a decade ago, a German, more than, I think, 50 years ago, the German famous scholar Klaus Westermann was already asking, you know, even before Brueggemann wrote his article, Costly Laws. He was asking how it happened, you know, that lament, which is a very natural part of human life. You know. Yeah. See, it's a lament now. Okay. Yeah. Oh, no. Okay. Yeah. You have to see. Has completely disappeared, you know. Why indeed? You know? And I will share with you three possible reasons. The first is sociological, could be. The second is theological, and the third is biblical studies. The first two have been mentioned by scholars already in treatment, so my comments will be brief. But the third one has not been shared. You know, the biblical scholars and so on. No? Social location, you know, sociology. You know. Some lament psalms can only be understood from a position of weakness, limitation, and vulnerability. An example of this is Psalm 10:10. Break the arm of the wicked. In Psalm 10:15, the psalmist is crying out because the wicked, the powerful wicked, and they own every places of authority, has been pressing and crushing down the weak. And the weak now has nowhere to go to but to God. You know. And you see this situation in many parts of the world, like non-Western, you know, like so much oppression and violence. So these kinds of laments can be understood more by people in that context. But people in the West may find it hard. Many of the so-called first world countries will find it difficult to identify with the situation in Psalm 10, as Stephen Lakis points out, that when faced with perceived injustices or threat, okay, the members of the Western Church would seem to have better options for seeking their own retribution, for effecting their own destruction and annihilation of their enemies, than appealing solely to the mighty hand of God, which is the final recourse only of the poor and the powerless. So sometimes people that come from other places because of their social location may find it difficult to understand. I will never forget the look of unbelief in the eyes of a British man. After I shared something on the precatory prayer when I was studying in England, so he said to me, I can't imagine, you know, how anyone praying in that way, you know, or this, maybe in his particular social location, it's impossible for him to think about that. But for those who are in locations of vulnerability, they can, you know. As Belden Lane points out, these prayers, like the imprecatory Psalm 10, I quote, can only result from a prolonged and painful look on unrelieved suffering. In contrast, he says, there is a comfortable triumphalism that too often has characterized the common prayer of enculturated Christianity. It lacks that passionate longing and impatience for the reign of God that frequently marks the churches of the oppressed. That's by Belden Lane. Lament comes from a place of I would say, weakness. This is one of the reasons, according to Rees Bezan, why Western evangelicals find it hard to lament. He says, one of the most significant reasons why Western evangelicals find it hard to lament is because as a movement, we have failed to recognize how drunk we are on power and how allergic we are to weakness. That's a Westerner speaking. American theologian Douglas John Hall confesses that one of the greatest problems among American believers is that, and I quote, we cannot bring ourselves as a people to contemplate our failure. Yeah, I can see some nodding there. No? So that's one reason, sociological. Okay. The second is, I missed the one. Okay, theological. In his article entitled "If God is Good, Why Lament?" Nicholas Wolterstorff explains that it was the theologians of the Christian traditions, namely Augustine and Calvin, who have called lament into question. Interesting, no? For Augustine, one can only lament for one's own sin. So lament in terms of repentance, but not for other things. Okay? Wolterstorff points out that Augustine thought that it's wrong to voice suffering unless one does so in the context of confession of sin. Now, you lament for your sin, but you don't lament for other things. No? As for John Calvin, his emphasis on sovereignty of God led him to believe that lament does not have a place in the life of faith. He did not say that we should deny that we were suffering or facing problems, but he encouraged people to embrace this suffering without asking why. Okay? This is because we already know why. God has a purpose in allowing the suffering, so you don't complain. But if you say that to a suffering person, like for example, when the strongest typhoon in recorded history hit one of the provinces in Metro Manila and destroyed everything, like in that town. After, I think a few weeks, some Christians came there encouraging the people, and a woman who lost everything, her house, everything, even parts of some of his family, they told her, God has a purpose for you. She got angry, she got mad. Good for you, you know the purpose, she said. I don't, Now, so you have sociological, theological. So some of the best theologians then have not been helpful. In fact, they have somehow hindered, according to Wolterstorff, the promotion of lament. In the next part, I would argue that actually even the biblical scholars, their writing and so on, have somehow hindered the promotion of lament. The biblical scholars are important because their work is foundational. If you believe that the Bible is the Word of God, the biblical scholars would focus on that, and then the theologians would use what they have discovered and then apply to theology, pastoral, and so on. So they always go back to scholars like Walter Brueggemann. They're always quoted by counselors writing about lament and counseling and so on. And the movement towards the recovery of lament was started also by biblical scholars. Okay? So their work is really important. But what is the view of lament? But there's something there, because how do they view lament? Lament in biblical studies is understood in terms of a movement from lament to praise. And that is true, okay? Because lament would sometimes begin with, "How long, O Lord, how long?" and then end with praise. And this is the emphasis. For example, Gunkel said that the order on many psalms of lament is a characteristic one. First, the wailing, okay, almost desperate lament, then suddenly the certainty of deliverance in a jubilant tone. Okay? That's by Hermann Gunkel, the father of form criticism. Okay? And then, if you look at the way he analyzed the Psalms, the structure of the Psalms moves from invocation, then there is the complaint, "How long, O Lord," for example, and then "Consider and answer me," that's the petition, But then you move to motivation, and then there's a certainty of hearing. There's an expression of trust, and at the end, vow. So that you have this movement from lament to praise. Klaus Westermann's structure is similar. He would begin with an address, same invocation, then lament, and then turning toward God, petition, and then vow of praise. So you move away from lament. In fact, Westermann is amazed that there are no psalms, he says, and I quote him here, which do not, says, progress beyond petition and lament. Okay? Westermann declares that the cry of God is always underway from supplication to lament. And the key word is always. You always move from lament to praise. Okay? That's it. But is it true that lament is always underway to praise? Well, Brueggemann himself corrected him. In fact, he cited Psalm 88. This Psalm 88 does not end with vow of praise. If you want really one of the darkest psalms of lament, it's Psalm 88. The word darkness is the last word there. It ends with that word. You have taken my loved ones from me, and my companion is darkness. Okay? So Brueggemann said, no, it's not right. There's Psalm 88. But then, on the whole, Brueggemann only emphasized the movement in the lament in terms of the one-way movement. No. For him, lament is best pursued by Gonco's study of form criticism, which is basically beginning with invocation, complaint, lament, petition, and so on, vow, praise, and so on. Even where Brueggemann employs Paul Ricoeur's theory of language, it is the form critical view, lament to praise, which imposes itself. In the framework which he developed called orientation, disorientation, and new orientation, which I mentioned earlier, we see the same one-way movement from lament to praise. Brueggemann says that the speech has form, which proceeds from plea to praise. That's the form. The form of the lament contains a dramatic movement. Okay. Now, Brueggemann sees two basic movements from orientation to disorientation, from disorientation to new orientation. And I remember I was teaching Bible study in one of the slum areas in Manila. I was pastor there for 9 years in this particular church. And I was sharing about this orientation, disorientation, and new orientation. And one of the members that I mentioned just got his house burned, And he asked me right there that evening. So I was saying, you move from orientation to disorientation to new orientation. And then this brother of mine said, but Pastor, is it possible to move backwards, like from new orientation to disorientation? Or is it possible to be disorientation and new orientation at the same time? He's asking questions that, wow, Western scholars are not asking, and I was there like, that evening I had the idea for my thesis already, Sometimes the Lord reveals ideas, not in the very nice libraries. I like the Lanier library, by the way, but sometimes you find it, right there, in the streets, So you have to be open, You have to listen to them. That actually helped me a lot, Because in my research, I noticed that German scholars, Western scholars, English, Americans, they only say lament to praise, and so on. And even Brueggemann, for example, he doesn't see any possibility of a backward movement. Because he said, unlike here, that the Jewish articulation and reception of new orientation is decisively embodied in the resurrection of Christ. So he compares lament, the death of Christ, to the disorientation, and then the resurrection to new orientation. Okay? So from death, there's no way you can move from resurrection to death, isn't it? Like just one way. It eliminates any other possibility, of a more tragic maybe, or a movement back to the lament, And I think this is the problem with the dominant view of the lament, is that it is one-sided, It's like one way, I think it reflects also the Western framework, from problem to resolution, from scientific, like the Enlightenment period. You always move progress, You don't move backward. That's not good. You don't even stay where you are, like Psalm 18. You move forward, So even if you are still grieving, come on, move on. But what if I cannot still move on? Well, brother, there's no place for you there, Lament to praise only. So that's one of the dominant view of the lament is able to contain only one movement, but it is incapable of embracing the possibility of other movements, especially the opposite movement. That's the big problem there. But the question here is, are all laments, in fact, do they have a resolution at the end? As I mentioned, no. Not all laments move. Okay. In fact, there are 16 laments with no resolution at the end. Okay. And I show you this one. Look at some of the words. Psalm 12 says, on every side the wicked prowl, as violence is exalted among the children of men. I mean, after crying out to God, Lord, have mercy, help us. And in fact, in the middle of that psalm, God says, I will now arise. But then it ended with this. By the way, even in spite of the response of the Lord, there you go, violence is exalted. I find that, it's so real, isn't it? That it's not all certainty at the end. There's also uncertainty, And then you find that many of these psalms end not with praise, but with petitions, like Psalm 25, redeem Israel, O God, or 28, O save your people. Look at Psalm 38 as well. Make haste to help, O Lord, and so on. And then some of these end with complaint, like the famous Psalm 88. Look at that. You have caused my beloved. It's a Psalm 88. My beloved and my friend to shun me. And he's talking to God, by the way. You. That's like, wow. You never accuse of God like that. My companions have become darkness. And then Psalm 120, okay, is a complaint. It says, I am for peace, but when I speak, they are for war. And the last word in Psalm 120 is war. How about that for an ending? Talk about resolution. There's still, like conflict and this war. And in the list of 16, there are 5 psalms which move the opposite direction, from thanksgiving or praise to lament. Psalm 9 and 10, Psalm 40, Psalm 44, Psalm 89, Psalm 120. Okay? Psalm 9 and 10 appears as a separate psalm in your English Bible, in our English Bible, but actually the two are one. And how do we know that? And you have to learn Hebrew to do that, because the Psalm 9 and 10 is composed using the Hebrew alphabet. So Psalm 9:1 begins with the Aleph, I will give thanks to the Lord, and it's a thanksgiving psalm. But then somewhere in the middle, once he reaches 10:1, it begins with when he reaches letter L, Lamed, begins with Lama. Why, oh Lord? Wow. And Gonko cannot understand this because he was already thanking God, And then he moved in the middle. He says, why, oh Lord, do you stand far off? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble? So you have the movement from thanksgiving, joyful, and then to the lament. Psalm 40 is very interesting because the first part is thanksgiving, and then the second part is a lament, But that second part, from verse 14 to 18, is actually taken from another psalm, Psalm 70, which is a lament. So somebody who composed Psalm 40 took a lament, Psalm 70, and then composed a thanksgiving at the beginning, and then he put lament at the end. Why would he do that? Why not put the lament first? Normally, when we compose songs, it's, you lament first, and even testimonies like, I've been in trouble, but, So from minor to major. But this one is from major key to minor key, why would they compose a psalm which moved the opposite direction? And this is interesting because the dominant movement in the lament is from lament to praise. Like you would begin, there are more lament psalms at the beginning and the middle, but then towards the end you have the hallelujah. But what are these lament psalms with opposite movements saying? Why? And I think one of the messages there is there's a sense of protest there, that life, we don't see the dominant movement in our life, And so these are placed, they're composed to a particular, so they have an important message to tell us, I don't have time to talk about Psalm 44, 89, 120, but you can read my Psalms commentary if you like, 2 volumes, yeah, okay. Now, the dominant view of the lament have failed to consider these other laments, those which do not end with any resolution, and those which move from praise to lament. It only saw one movement, and as I mentioned, it has a limited vision. If we are to recover lament, we need an encompassing vision of lament and praise. A vision that sees not only one movement from lament to praise, but also the opposite movement from praise to lament. Actually, Herman Gunkel already gave an expression to this vision. I think he had a glimpse of it, but because he used form-critical category framework to read it, he lost that vision. Because he said something like this, Can we read this together? In the alternation between lament and song of thanks, rolls the whole crowd. This statement expresses a vision of lament which sees the whole of life. I love this quotation right here. I think it gives you an expression of what the lament should be, in relation to praise. And the first thing is that we see here is that we are encompassed by the lament, This vision sees the whole life of believers as held by lament and praise. The life of faith is characterized not just by praise, but by praise and lament, in the alternation of lament and praise. Nothing is outside lament and praise. We are always in between. Sometimes we feel very close to praise, Other times we feel as if we are in the very depths of lament, or there are also times when we feel as if we are being torn into two as we find ourselves between lament and praise. But wherever we think or feel we may be, we're always somewhere, like in a spectrum, in between lament and praise. Where are you tonight? Okay. Are you sort of more closer to praise, or to lament, or somewhere in between? The whole life of the pious alternates between lament and praise. The idea of alternation implies that the movement is not only from lament to praise, isn't it? You alternate. You also move from praise to lament. The movement between the two is a two-way street, and the traffic goes both ways, moving from lament to praise and also from praise to lament. Unfortunately, Gunkel and other biblical scholars only saw one movement, or at least emphasize only the one movement. But they didn't emphasize, or they didn't talk much about the other movement. And that's why lament became too confident, too certain. There's always an answer at the end, like that. There's no trepidation, they would say. There's always, strength, confidence that God is there, Because when there is no opposite movement, then lament becomes tension-free. Amen. Because there's nothing that's pulling it to the opposite direction. Okay, you can picture. There's always lament, there's always confident. But as Westermann declares, and Westermann as well, actually he also saw a glimpse of this. there is a polarity, that's another word. He declared that in my years of work on the Old Testament, and by the way, he started working during the time of war when he was a prisoner of war, He said, it has become increasingly clear to me that the literary categories of Psalms of Lament and Psalms of Praise are not only two distinct categories among others, but that they are the literary forms which characterize the Psalter as a whole, related as they are as polar opposites. Here, Westermann gives us another important image. So Gunkel mentioned alternation. I think that's important. Here, polarity. But Westermann is less inclined to see lament and praise as simply endpoints between which the life of pious unrolls. They're not just endpoints. He prefers to speak of them as polar opposites. The opposite points on a compass which are in complete opposition, even contradiction. So lament and praise. Gunkel's concept of alternations, for me, seems orderly, and tidy, So lament goes first, you go ahead, and then, praise to lament, and then. But that's not what we see in real life, There's not just alternation, there is tension, there is collision, there's clashes. That's life for you. There's polarity and so on. Lament and praise represent two opposing and contradictory points, represented by the two movements. So the movement from lament to praise points to an experience of answer. There's an answer, there's deliverance. But the opposite movement points to the absence of the answer. There's no answer at the end. It's entirely opposite you're talking here. Because it's moving the opposite direction. Instead of deliverance, there's defeat, no? Instead of resolution, there's non-resolution. The movement from lament to praise points to a God who answers prayer, who is faithful and good. But the other movement points to a God who doesn't respond, a God who abandons his people just when they needed him, a God who hides himself in times of trouble. Psalm 10 says, "Why, O Lord, do you stand far? Why do you hide just when we needed me? When we needed you at this particular time?" So you see entirely opposite, depictions of God. And the lament that moves from lament to praise, the response there is a yes, So you become yes men and yes women, But where do you learn to say no to God? It's in the opposite direction. It's the opposite direction. A response of no, doubt, and protest. And if we follow the direction to which the lament with the opposite direction is pointing, we will see that it is leading to the place which I would call the tragic, isn't it? Like the tragic. The lament at the polar end of the praise reflects a tragic vision. A tragic vision has three characteristics. The tragic vision, by the way, is the vision put forth by the classical Greek tragedy. And according to authors, some of the characteristics of a tragic vision is the absence of resolution at the end. Isn't that what we see in the opposite movement? It's a negative view of God. In fact, the gods in the Greek tragedies are malevolent, they are wicked, They abandon the people, and protest, A tragic vision arises, according to Richard Sewell, when traditional values begin to lose their power to comfort and sustain, and man finds himself once more groping in the dark, because the tradition won't work anymore, And if we look at these Psalms that I mentioned, Psalm 9 and 10 and so on, they resemble the tragic vision that they can be called, and that's why I call them tragic laments. In the book that I'm writing, Tragic Laments, I will be more detailed, showing how Psalm 9 and 10, the portrayal of God and so on, the other Psalms of Lament represents the polar opposite. There are what we call degrees in the laments. Not all laments are the same. Some laments are lighter, not too dark, and so on. But as you go further from praise, you reach the farthest end. What kind of a psalm is at the very end? I would call that a tragic lament. Okay? The polar opposite of praise is tragic lament. And the tragic laments, like the tragic vision, comes as a result of the tension, between faith and experience. In the face of radical evil and radical suffering, it is impossible to not struggle, your faith. I mean, what's happening to the world now, in the world now? And we see this tension even in the Psalm 9 and 10, He thanks God in Psalm 9 because God answers prayer, God delivers. He is the refuge for the oppressed. But then in Psalm 10, he says, why is the wicked, killing the innocent, and you're not doing anything? We might not like the word tragic, but that's a reality, But the good thing about the tragic laments, and they're important, because they articulate the experience of the tension, that gives language to the contradiction in the life of faith, and it gives voice to the language of the lament in the face of radical evil and radical suffering. The tragic laments create space for those whose experience is the opposite of the dominant movement. Those whose prayers have not been answered, those who have not been delivered, those whose house got burned, those caught in the middle of the war, those who have experienced deep loss instead of recovery, death instead of life. There is the tragic lament. The tragic laments enable us to face what Rowan Williams describes in his book, Tragic Imagination, as that which is utterly unresolved in human experience. Rowan Williams reminds us that at some point, even, I quote him here, even the most confident faith has to be honest about what is utterly unresolved in human experience. What cannot be made sense? If making sense means showing why it's good thing, really, unquote. And at such times, one of the most urgently need thing that we need to do, according to him, is how to speak of failure and pain without comfortable lying. Because we're good at that. We're good at just denying, yeah, it's okay, yeah. And so it takes a lot of courage, actually, to face these tragic laments and to be there. Sometimes we think of them as, they must have lost their faith. No. They have a lot of courage, and a lot of belief. And the reason why they're crying out why is because they really believe in the God of justice. They really believe that God is good, But if you don't, then why do you don't need to struggle. But if you take God seriously, they take God seriously and His Word in a broken world. And that is why they really struggle. But the beautiful thing about these brothers and sisters of ours who wrote these words, not just David, but the people of the Lord, is that they had the courage to put this into writing, which became part of the Word of God, that we can pray, When we struggle with life, we just don't understand what's happening. God, why? Because where do we learn to be honest about what is utterly unresolved? Where do we utter words which are discouraging? Don't say that. That's too negative. Well, you learn that in the tragic laments. Okay? How do we speak of failure and pain without comfortable lying? It is through the tragic laments. Unfortunately, we have lost the sense of the tragic, which is why there's a continuing loss of the tragic. The tragic loss of lament is because of the loss of the tragic in the lament. Okay? If we want to recover the lament, we need to also emphasize the tragic laments, especially during our time. Thank you. Thank you very much.
You pastored for a number of years.
Yes.
On any given Sunday when you stand to preach, what percentage of the people out there are having a broken, desperate, traumatic, disorientated week, disordered?
At least about a third.
About a third of the people
Yeah.
who have come to your church, they've gotten news about their own health, maybe the death of a friend, the death of a family member, the loss of a job, whatever. And they're dealing with this stuff. And about 1/3 of the Psalms are laments.
Yes.
Well, didn't God waste his time putting all that in there if we're not going to really lament?
Yeah. It's really a waste.
That's one way to say it, yeah. Have you read the book Silence by Shishkova Indo, or seen the movie?
Yes.
Your thoughts?
That's a very helpful movie, and somebody gave me a book which I read as well. I think it depicts part of the tragic sense as well, the struggle in the midst of a very impossible almost situation. So I read the book, and my thoughts there.
We had students read that, incoming students read that at Wheaton College when I was there. Important book. When does lament cross over the line to become blasphemy?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Are there lament psalms that you consider to have come close to the line?
Right. That's a valid question, and I think one of the things that helped me is the word honesty to God and deep relationship with Him. As long as you have an intimate relationship with God, and you be honest about Him, you can actually say, "Lord, I don't know if this is too much, but I can't. It doesn't really make sense." And sometimes you would say, "And I don't like what you're doing, and I don't know why you're doing this, Lord. And you might be angry with me, but please, Lord." Like Abraham when he prays, isn't it? He asked God. So there is reverence, but also there is honesty. But if you belong to churches of the oppressed, you just express your anger. Don't think about being composed. Sometimes Christians are too composed, too nice. Am I ready? So you just say nice things to God. But you know that in every relationship, if you only say nice things, all the time, maybe you have not reached that depth of relationship because you're still, cute, to each other. Nice things, I mean, when boyfriend and girlfriend, But when you get married, oh boy, good luck,
Thank you very much. How does access to global news impact the way we lament? In other words, a lot of our news is sort of just local, American kind of sports, weather, but we don't know about the typhoons that hit the Philippines or know very little about it, or other wars, let's say.
One very important lesson that we can learn from the lament is that there is individual, but also there's communal lament, and the two are intertwined. Because you do not live by your own, you live in a community. So you have Psalm 42-43 is an individual lament, followed by Psalm 44, which is a communal lament. Psalm 73 is an individual lament, and Psalm 44 is a communal lament. You do not lament in your isolation. You lament. Sometimes somebody asked me, I was preaching or was lecturing among clergy, Anglican clergy in Australia, and one of them asked me, I cannot identify with the lament, because basically my life here is okay, and I said, that's why you lament on behalf, You try to, you might be no problem with you, you are living this life, but. So you have to learn, and that's where Langham Partnership comes in because, and I like what Lanier is doing, because you're opening up your doors to the voices of people like us from the majority world, so that somehow you have a glimpse that this is not just my world, In fact, our world is too small, like a bubble. So broaden your world. And then you lament on behalf of others. Thank you for that question.
Does lamenting move God to intervene?
Definitely, yes. And so when you are in trouble, for example, the psalmist, they would really, because of their desperation, they would just use all kinds of motivations. Lord, like, God, if you don't answer me, I'll die. Look at my tears. My tears are the bottom. They would use that. And for some reason, God is like us. We are moved not much by intellect, although lectures sometimes could be, too intellectual, And that's important, okay? But something about lament is that you go deeper and you feel. And I told you about earlier story, although jokingly only. But that was a lament for me. So one day, I was looking for a scholarship. I'm teaching already in seminary, but I need a PhD, but I don't have the money and the school and so on. And I was crossing EDSA, the busiest highways. And you can actually walk down, lamenting, Why is it, Lord, that we don't, why can't you answer me? Why? And so I'm asking why. I'm glad I was able to cross without being hit. But right after that, I went to my office, and there I received an email from Langham. He says, because I applied, it says, Dear Federico, and I took I covered the monitors. I read, because I don't want to see right away the message, because he said, I am, if the third word would be sorry, but it says, I am pleased to, okay, So I received the scholarship, And I think because I really prayed hard, I lamented. And in many parts of my life, I noticed that as well. If I just pray like, can you please, Lord, come? Okay, nothing. But with the desperation and real lament, so that helps a lot. Move the heart of God.
What is the relationship between grief and lament? Are they the same?
Yeah, the word lament has a lot of meanings. It could anthropologically, it came from the funeral, isn't it? The dead, We have dirges, so those are laments. You call that. You grieve, you mourn, and so on. That's also lament. In biblical studies, however, it became lament as prayer to God. Okay, so from the dead to the lament. But then in biblical studies, they removed the grieving, because grieving is more like moving backwards, isn't it? So even I think Brueggemann would say that the dirges, are not really biblical lament. It's not really biblical lament, but there's something about grieving, the process of grieving, that is important for biblical lament. Even if you go to Psalm 137, at the very late already, the book 5, what do the people say there? By the rivers of Babylon, we wept. Man, you're already in book 5, you're still grieving, Because sometimes grieving takes a long time. It's a whole process. And the problem with us is, or sometimes because from in book 5, that's where praise is. Well, there's still mourning there, grieving there, and it's okay. It's a whole process. Yeah? Yep.
What suggestions would you offer to including lament in modern worship services?
What
suggestions would you offer to church leaders, pastors, deacons, other people who lead their churches? How would we include that in a modern worship service?
First of all, you need to buy my book. It's okay to be
this
not
book,
okay.
it's okay not to be okay.
By the way, it's okay to be not okay, but if you don't buy this book, it's not okay. So now, in this book, I share my story as a pastor, how I taught lament for about 2 years in our prayer meetings and so on. And one time after 2 years, one of my members after the service suddenly just stood up and just started to cry, lament. And we just had a wonderful communal lament first time, but after 2 years. So what's my suggestion? Teach lament, in prayer meetings, Bible studies during Holy Week if you can, whenever you have. And then gather the composers and then let them compose songs, not just by Matt Redman, or the 10,000 Reasons. I wish there will be composers who would compose the tragic laments, more. Doesn't have to end with the rejoicing right away, because some people are not yet there, moving on. And my daughter, by the way, her name is Faye, is a composer. So one time when I spoke in a particular conference, I spoke on lament, and she composed songs. I should have played her songs here now, of lament. Very, very powerful, So, yeah, I could share some of her songs for you for free since you came here. Just kidding.
So there might be some songwriters listening, or maybe they're watching on the internet or something that they might be moved to say, look, let me turn to one of those Psalms of Lament and see if I can write a song like that would come with the same tone, the same mood, the same recognition of the injustice, of the pain that life sometimes brings.
Exactly.
This is maybe a more modern question. What do you listen to when you lament? What's on your playlist, your list?
One of them is Porter's Gate, one of them. They have a song called Christ Has No Body But Yours. He has no hands but yours. No? He has no feet. He has no eyes but yours. No? And so the prayer is that I may be your eyes, Lord. Let me be your hands, to touch people. Let me be your lips, and so on. It's a powerful. It's not exactly lament, but the mode, it's a prayer. So those kinds of things. That's an American song. I mean, I don't know if it's a British or what. But aside from that, our own Filipino songs, we call them kundiman, which is very minor key. Many of the Tagalog songs are very somber and pain, because of our long experience of colonization. We've been under the Spaniards for 350 years. And then, sadly, also we were under Americans, for 40 years, So not easy. Maybe now I'm still lamenting, although I'm smiling. But these are not easy, for us as a people. And yet, because of colonial mentality sometimes, we only sing mostly English songs. And that's, so I would often say to our song leader in the church, we have Tagalog songs? We are very good singers. We're composers as well. Why are we singing only, this song? But that's a problem sometimes. Whether there's now some changes.
When my husband was intubated in the hospital for 4 months with COVID, I did not know from moment to moment whether he was still alive because I was not allowed to visit him. I lamented and cried out to the Lord most of the time, night and day.
Yeah.
But oh, how encouraging were the songs of hope.
Yes.
Victory in Christ, songs like that, over death and sickness. Couldn't it be that maybe the Holy Spirit reminds us during church services that community gives us strength, gives strength to the weak? Is lament more beneficial in private and shouts of victory in corporate worship?
Yeah, can I? Yeah, because there are two questions here. The first one is in how during the times of suffering, not grieving because it's still suffering there, the positive words, hope, became encouragement. And that is true because whoever wrote this, you are already in lament, you see, and you're already lamenting. So you're moving from lament and then there's words of hope, you know. That's what we, but without that lament first, the words of comfort would have no meaning at all. It would be shallow, okay? Many of our songs today are shallow because they have not been to the depths, you know. Yeah. So they are related. It's not wrong. I'm not saying that we should no longer sing these victory songs and so on. You know. But the problem is, if it is only that, you know, and people are not coming from places of lament, you know, and are being taught only to praise, you know. In fact, they're being told, not directly maybe, but implicitly, you know, that the only valid response to God is rejoicing and praise, you know. So that's one question, what's the response? The second question is lament more at work individually? Well, in the modern period, yes, because we have lost a sense of community in many places. But in olden times, you know, like in Israel, communal lament is very like normal, you know. So I would say that, if, for example, in a mega church, you begin with small groups, maybe, because that work better, you know. But in the bigger congregation, usually it's more difficult, you know, to have lament, unless there is a corporate reason. Unfortunately, the reason sometimes why they don't use the lament in the bigger part is that it is not a good promotion. Yeah. Like in bigger churches, you know, like why would you say that? But that's wrong, because young people today, you know, are turning away from the church because they don't find the church, they cannot connect with the church. It's so, they're going through a lot. But then the church is only a church for happy people, you know. You know, if you cannot preach in the church, if you cannot lament as a people, you know, as a big congregation, then there's a problem as well with that, because you are communicating a message, you know. That lament is only for private, you know, that's only for you. But when we God, we should always be okay, you know. Should always be, because we're the people of God, you know, something like that. Yeah. Thanks for that two questions.
That's a good question.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
Final question here. We've got a lot of great questions. I'll pass these on to Mark. Mark is going to be interviewing you tomorrow morning in his Sunday school class over at Champion Forest Baptist Church. So it's at 9:30. And this is one that we'd love to hear your thoughts on. Could you please speak briefly on Jesus' cry from the cross, Lema, Lema, Sabachthani?
Can you
Yes.
read again? Could you please?
Yeah, could you please speak briefly to Jesus' cry, my God, why have you forsaken me?
Thank you for asking that question. And I think it's an appropriate ending, you know, for lament, because when Jesus cried, my God, why have you forsaken me? He's actually quoting from Psalm 22, you know. And that's very important, because by praying the Psalms, Jesus is telling, the Psalms of Lament in particular, Jesus is teaching us, you know, the believers of Jesus, the Christians, to pray the lament as well. In fact, somebody said that he's praying his way through the Psalms on the cross. You know, into your hands I commit my spirit. That's also from Psalm 31. Earlier in his ministry, the disciples asked him, can you please teach us to pray? And he gave them our Father. But on the cross, he's pointing his disciples to the Psalms. You know, go to the Psalms. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? Secondly, that prayer signifies like a tragic lament. You know, you have to remember that he quoted only the first verse, and that psalm actually moved from lament to praise. You know? Okay, and some scholars would say that he has in mind also the deliverance. You know, possible. That's possible, but the fact that of all the verses in that lament, he did not quote the victory part, isn't it? You know, even, you know, he quoted the lament. You know? So even a lament which moves to praise already, you know, you can also focus on the beginning, you know, the lament part, because that's where you are at that moment, you know, a cry of abandonment. In the Gospel of Mark, that's the very last prayer, you know. Unlike in the other Gospels, you know, into your hands, there's trust. But the very first Gospel, the Gospel of Mark, ended with that cry, my God, And one philosopher, Simone Weil, considers the Gospel of Mark as a tragic, you know, book. Yeah, very interesting. And I think we need that to hear that gospel. And of course, the ending of the Gospel of Mark, you know, is not that the shorter ending, of course, you know.
Yeah.
Full of fear, and you would know this better. You know.
Yeah. Know a little bit about it.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Would you thank our presenter,
Thank you.
Rico Villanueva?